The cathedral doors were supposed to open to a future of love and power. Instead, they slammed shut on Gwendolyn's heart as her groom, standing before the high altar, loudly declared his love for another. Humiliated, stripped of her pack status, and left to the mercy of a ruthless medieval court, her life was effectively over. But fate has a wicked sense of humor. Just as her ruin was sealed, the most feared monster in the realm stepped forward to claim her. The air inside St. Bartholomew's Cathedral was thick with the suffocating scent of burning frankincense and crushed pine needles. Stained glass windows, towering 50 feet above the stone floor, fractured the midday sun into sharp, colorful blades of light that cut through the glue. It was the autumn of the 12th century in the kingdom of Eithogard, and the high nobility of the southern werewolf packs had gathered in their finest silks, velvets, and ceremonial armor to witness the union of two ancient bloodlines. Gwendolyn Croft stood at the altar, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was draped in a gown of heavy ivory brocade, embroidered with the silver crescent moons of her family's crest. A delicate veil of Moorish lace cascaded down her back, hiding the nervous tremble in her shoulders. Today she was to marry Lord Apollo Waverley, the future alpha of the Riverbend pack. It was an arranged match, engineered by her father, Lord Henry Croft, to save their dwindling territory from bankruptcy and bordering rogue attacks. Gwendolyn had accepted her duty. She had even convinced herself that she could love Apollo, with his golden hair, charming smile, and the respectable strength of his inner wolf. Beside her, Apollo stood rigidly in his dark emerald tunic. Yet as Father Clement, the ancient priest of the moon goddess, raised his hands to pronounce the binding words that would fuse their souls and pact lands together, Gwendolyn felt a sudden, freezing shift in the atmosphere. Apollo's scent, usually a comforting blend of oakwood and leather, soured with anxiety and something far more sinister, deceit. "Do you, Apollo of the House Waverley, take Gwendolyn to be your fated mate and Luna, to protect and honor her until the goddess calls your wolves home?" Father Clement's voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Silence stretched. It grew from a respectful pause into a suffocating void. Gwendolyn turned her head slightly, peering at Apollo through the sheer lace of her veil. His jaw was clenched, a muscle feathering near his ear. He looked out into the sea of guests, completely ignoring her. "Apollo," Gwendolyn whispered, her voice barely carrying over the crackle of the altar candles. Apollo stepped back. The movement was sharp, severing the physical distance between them. A collective gasp rippled through the packed cathedral. Lords and ladies leaned forward in their carved wooden pews, the rustle of their heavy garments sounding like a rising storm. "I cannot," Apollo said. His voice was loud, completely devoid of the hesitation he had shown moments before. He turned his gaze to Gwendolyn, and in his eyes she saw no warmth, only cold, hard ambition. "I cannot bind my soul to a female whose wolf is as weak and stagnant as the Croft bloodline." Gwendolyn felt as though she had been struck physically. The breath vanished from her lungs. "Apollo, what are you doing?" "We are before the goddess." "I am speaking the truth, Gwendolyn." Apollo interrupted, his voice booming for the entire congregation to hear. He gestured dramatically toward the front row. "A pack needs a strong Luna to survive the coming winters. I cannot tether the Riverbend pack to a woman who has yet to fully shift, whose inner wolf cowers in the shadows. My heart and my wolf belong to another, a true alpha female." From the front pew, a figure rose. The rustle of crimson silk announced her before she even stepped into the aisle. Lady Beatrice Harwood. Gwendolyn's breath hitched in a painful, tearing sound. Beatrice was her cousin, her closest confidant, the woman who had helped lace Gwendolyn into her wedding gown just hours ago. Beatrice's emerald eyes gleamed with a triumphant, predatory light as she glided up the steps, coming to stand right by Apollo's side. Apollo took Beatrice's hand, lifting it to his lips. "Beatrice is my true mate. We discovered the bond 3 moons ago. I will not live a lie, and I will not doom my pack to weakness." Chaos erupted in the cathedral. Lord Henry Croft surged to his feet, his face purple with rage, his claws extending as he roared his fury at the Waverley patriarch. Insults were hurled, and the metallic shing of swords being drawn echoed through the holy space. But Gwendolen was frozen in a nightmare. The betrayal was a physical agony, a sharp, twisting blade in her chest. She had confided her deepest insecurities to Beatrice, her struggle to connect with her wolf spirit, her fears of inadequacy. Beatrice had weaponized her vulnerability, feeding it to Apollo to usurp her position. "You planned this," Gethin Gwendolen choked out, staring at the woman she had called sister. "You humiliated me here, before the entire kingdom, to destroy my family completely." Beatrice offered a pitying, mock-sympathetic smile. "It is just the way of the wolves, Gwendolen. The strong survive. The weak are culled. You were never meant to wear a crown." Gwendolen's knees buckled under the weight of the absolute public ruin. Without this alliance, the Croft lands would be seized by creditors by nightfall. Her father would be stripped of his title. She would be an outcast, a rejected bride with a defective wolf, unmarriageable and unprotected. She sank to the cold stone floor, the ivory brocade pooling around her like a shroud. The shouting around her faded into a dull, roaring static. She was entirely, hopelessly doomed. The cathedral was a hair's breadth from an all-out bloodbath. The Croft loyalists and the Waverley guards were snarling, their faces shifting into their monstrous half-wolf forms, fangs bared. Father Clement was waving his hands frantically, begging for peace in the name of the goddess, but his pleas were lost in the cacophony of aristocratic fury. Apollo stood above Gwendolen, his arm wrapped protectively around Beatrice, looking down at his rejected bride with a sickening mixture of pity and disgust. Then a sound cut through the chaos. It was a slow, heavy rhythm. Boom, boom, boom. The massive iron-reinforced oak doors at the back of the cathedral shuddered under a tremendous impact. The arguing lords and ladies froze, their heads snapping toward the entrance. With a deafening crack that split the wood right down the middle, the doors burst completely open, ripping off their iron hinges and crashing onto the stone floor. A blast of freezing northern wind howled into the nave, extinguishing half the candles in the room and bringing with it an overwhelming, terrifying scent. It was the smell of deep winter, pine sap, fresh blood, and raw, unfiltered dominance. Every wolf in the room, from the lowest beater to Lord Waverley himself, involuntarily dropped their gaze. Some physically fell to their knees. The sheer, crushing weight of the aura rolling through the doors forced their inner wolves into submission. Through the dust and the swirling autumn leaves stepped a nightmare made flesh. King Roderick Valerius, the Alpha King of the Northern Bloodmoon Court. He was a mountain of a man, standing well over 6.5 feet tall, clad in pitch-black steel armor trimmed with the fur of monstrous dire wolves. A dark, heavy wool cloak swept the floor behind him. His hair was as black as a raven's wing, falling around a face carved from granite harsh, patrician, and flawlessly cruel. But it was his eyes that truly paralyzed the room. They were a piercing, luminous amber, glowing with an inner predatory fire. He was a myth to the soft southern packs, a warlord who had conquered the savage northern territories, known for ripping the throats out of rival alphas with his bare teeth. He did not attend society weddings. Roderick walked slowly down the central aisle, his heavy, steel-toed boots ringing out like death knells. He was flanked by 4 massive, silent warriors of his elite guard, but all eyes were fixed solely on the Alpha King. Apollo's previous bravado evaporated instantly. He pushed Beatrice slightly behind him, his face draining of all color. Roderick reached the altar. He didn't look at Lord Waverley, who was bowing so low his nose nearly touched the floor. He didn't look at Apollo. His glowing amber eyes dropped to the floor, fixing on Gwendolen, who was still kneeling in her ruined veil. For a second that felt like an eternity, the king simply stared at her. Gwendolen, though trembling with a mix of awe and terror, refused to lower her head. She met his glowing gaze, her own tear-streaked face locked in an expression of desperate defiance. She had nothing left to lose. A slow, dark smirk ghosted across Roderick's lips. It was a terrifying sight. Lord Waverley, Roderick's voice rumbled. It was deep, coarse, and carried effortlessly to every corner of the cathedral. I received your invitation. I note you failed to mention your son lacked the spine to honor his contracts. Lord Waverley stuttered, his knees practically knocking together. My king, we are honored. The situation has changed. My son found his true mate. Did he? Roderick finally turned his terrifying gaze to Apollo and then to the trembling Beatrice. He inhaled sharply, smelling the air. I smell ambition, deceit, and cheap perfume. I do not smell a mate bond. Apollo flushed, anger momentarily overriding his fear. You insult my Luna, King Roderick. Gwendolen's wolf is broken. She is useless to my pack. Faster than the human eye could track, Roderick moved. His gauntleted hand shot out, wrapping around Apollo's throat. He lifted the younger alpha a full foot off the ground. Apollo gagged, his legs kicking wildly, clawing at the impenetrable black steel of Roderick's armor. Beatrice screamed, scrambling backward. A boy who breaks a sacred vow at the altar knows nothing of strength. Roderick hissed softly, his amber eyes burning into Apollo's terrified face. The Riverbend pack owes the Bloodman Court a debt of 50,000 gold pieces, due today. I came to collect. We don't have it, Lord Waverley cried out, falling to his knees. The Croft dowry was supposed to pay the tithe. Please, my king, have mercy. Roderick carelessly tossed Apollo aside. The groom crashed into the stone steps, gasping and coughing violently. Roderick dusted his gauntlet off and turned his attention back to the kneeling bride. He stepped down, closing the distance until his massive, steel-clad boots stopped right at the edge of her ivory gown. Slowly, the feared Alpha King dropped to one knee, bringing himself eye-level with Gwendolen. Up close, the raw power radiating from him was intoxicating, making Gwendolen's dormant inner wolf stir, whining softly in the back of her mind the sensation she hadn't felt in years. A king requires a queen, Gwendolen Croft, Roderick said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre meant only for her. I require a Luna who understands the bitterness of betrayal, a woman who knows the absolute depths of humiliation, for she will never allow her court to fall into it. Gwendolen stared at him, her breath shallow. Why me? She whispered. He spoke the truth. My wolf, she does not speak to me. I am broken. Roderick reached out. His large hand, surprisingly gentle despite the lethal armor, brushed a stray tear from her cheek. I do not care for southern superstitions. Your eyes possess a fire this pathetic rune lacks. You are drowning here, little wolf. Take my hand and I will give you the power to drown them instead. He stood, extending his large armored hand toward her. The entire cathedral held its breath. Lord Henry Croft stared in absolute shock. Beatrice looked physically ill. Apollo was clutching his throat, watching in horror. Gwendolen looked at the hand offered to her. If she stayed, she was a pariah, a laughingstock. If she took his hand, she would belong to the most brutal warlord in the continent. But looking back up into Roderick's fierce, unwavering gaze, she saw something she had never seen in Apollo, absolute unyielding certainty. With a steadying breath, Gwendolen reached up and placed her small, delicate hand into the massive, armored grip of the Alpha King. Roderick's fingers closed around hers, warm and solid. He pulled her to her feet, bringing her to stand flush against his side. He turned to face the terrified congregation, his arm wrapping around her waist, branding her as his own. The debt is settled, Roderick announced, his voice vibrating through the cathedral. Gwendolen Croft is now under the absolute protection of the Blood Moon Court. She is my bride. If any man, woman, or wolf speaks a word against her, I will personally return to this pathetic city and burn it to the bedrock. Without waiting for a response, he turned and led her down the aisle, away from the altar, away from her betrayal, and into the freezing unknown. They did not stay for pleasantries. There was no farewell to her father, no time to pack her belongings, no tearful goodbyes. The moment Gwendolen stepped through the shattered cathedral doors, the freezing autumn air hit her like a physical blow, snapping her out of the surreal haze of the last hour. Outside, a massive black carriage awaited, constructed of heavy ironwood and pulled by 6 monstrous midnight black draft horses. They were larger than any steeds Gwendolen had ever seen, their breath pluming in thick clouds of steam. Surrounding the carriage was Roderick's vanguard 50 heavily armored warriors, sitting atop restless horses, their faces concealed behind terrifying iron visors forged in the shape of snarling wolves. Roderick practically lifted Gwendolen into the velvet-lined interior of the carriage. He followed immediately after, sealing the heavy door shut behind them, blocking out the frantic shouts of the Eitelgard citizens who had gathered to witness the commotion. "Move out," Roderick commanded. The carriage lurched forward violently. The thunderous sound of 200 hooves striking the cobblestones echoed off the city walls. Gwendolen was thrown back against the plush leather seat, her ivory wedding gown taking up most of the space in the cabin. She pulled her knees together, shivering as the adrenaline finally began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep cold. Roderick sat opposite her, an impenetrable wall of black steel and dark fur. He removed his gauntlets, revealing large, heavily scarred hands, and then unclasped his heavy wool cloak. Without a word, he leaned forward and draped the massive fur-lined garment over Gwendolen's shivering frame. It swallowed her completely. The cloak smelled intensely of hymnwood smoke, pine, and that strange metallic tang of raw power. It was instantly, surprisingly warming. "Thank you," she murmured, clutching the edges of the cloak tightly. Roderick leaned back, crossing his arms over his broad chest. He studied her in the dim light of the carriage, his glowing amber eyes intensely focused. "You are quiet for a woman whose life has just been overturned." Gwendolen swallowed the lump in her throat. "I am trying to determine if I have merely traded one executioner for another, Your Grace." A deep, rumbling chuckle vibrated in Roderick's chest. It was a rich sound entirely at odds with his terrifying reputation. "If I wanted you dead, little wolf, I would not have wasted perfectly good breath arguing with that pathetic boy in the cathedral. I would have simply burned the building down with you all inside." Gwendolen blinked, momentarily stunned by his bluntness. "Then why did you do it? You settled a 50,000 gold piece debt in exchange for a broken, disgraced bride. The Northern Pax will think you have gone mad." "The Northern Pax think what I tell them to think," Roderick replied smoothly. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "I am a king, Gwendolen. Everything I do is calculated. Ethelgard is growing bold. The Southern Pax need a reminder of who holds the true power in this realm, taking the prize of their high society right from under the nose of their future alpha." He smirked. It was a strategic humiliation, a masterstroke. Gwendolen felt a sharp pang of disappointment, though she chided herself for it. Of course it was politics. She was just a pawn on a different, much larger chessboard. "So, I am merely a trophy to be paraded." Roderick's eyes darkened, the amber flaring with sudden intensity. "Do not put words in my mouth. You are my mate." Gwendolen froze. "Mate? That is impossible. I felt no bond." "You cannot possibly—" "I felt it the moment I shattered those cathedral doors," Roderick interrupted, his voice dropping to a low, possessive growl. "My wolf roared for you. It was why I spared Apollo's miserable life. Had I killed him on the altar, the trauma to your soul might have been irreversible. You are mine, Gwendolen. The bond is there, slumbering beneath whatever damage those southern fools have done to your spirit. I will awaken it." Before Gwendolen could process the monumental weight of his words, the carriage jolted violently to a halt. The deafening sound of a massive explosion rocked the ironwood frame, throwing Gwendolen completely off the seat and onto the floor. Roderick was instantly on his feet, his massive frame shielding her as the carriage violently tilted to one side. Shouts and the terrifying, guttural snarls of shifting wolves erupted outside. The metallic clash of swords ringing against armor filled the air. "Ambush!" One of Roderick's guards roared from outside. "Rogues! They've blocked the mountain pass." Roderick's eyes flashed from amber to a brilliant, terrifying gold. His canines elongated instantly, extending past his lips. "Stay down," he commanded Gwendolen, his voice distorted, layering with the monstrous growl of his inner beast. He kicked the heavy carriage door open. It flew off its hinges, taking a rogue wolf out in the process. Gwendolen scrambled to the edge of the doorway, peering out into the twilight. They were deep in the Whispering Woods, a notorious stretch of no man's land between the southern territories and the northern mountains. The carriage was surrounded by dozens of massive feral wolves. But as Gwendolen squinted through the dim light, she noticed something chilling. Some of the attackers weren't robes at all. They wore the shredded, hastily disguised armor of the Waverley Guard. Lord Waverley hadn't let them go. He had sent a kill squad to eliminate the Alpha King and his stolen bride, aiming to erase his debt and his family's humiliation in one bloody ambush. Roderick didn't even draw a sword. With a roar that shook the very leaves from the ancient trees, he leapt from the carriage. Mid-air, his massive body contorted. Bones snapped and reformed in a split second. By the time he hit the ground, the man was gone. In his place stood a monster. Roderick's wolf form was the size of a warhorse, covered in thick, midnight black fur. His eyes were burning golden suns in the gathering dark. 3 Waverley wolves lunged at him simultaneously. Roderick didn't flinch. He caught the first in his massive jaws, snapping its neck with a sickening crunch. He swiped a massive, claw-tipped paw at a second, sending the wolf flying into a tree with fatal force. Gwendolen watched, utterly mesmerized by the sheer, devastating brutality of her new husband. The blood and the violence should have terrified her. But as she watched the giant black wolf tear through their attackers, shielding her carriage with his own body, a strange burning sensation ignited in the pit of her stomach. Deep within her, beneath years of anxiety suppression and the crushing weight of her family's disappointment, something ancient and wild stirred. The phantom sensation of a tail flicked. The ghostly echo of a growl rumbled in her chest. Her inner wolf, dormant for 20 years, was waking up to answer the call of its alpha. The skirmish was a slaughter, brief and terrifyingly one-sided. Roderick's vanguard did not fight with the polished, ceremonial grace of the Southern Knights. They fought like the feral beasts they were named for, but it was the Alpha King who commanded the absolute center of the carnage. Gwendolen remained huddled in the shattered doorway of the carriage, unable to tear her eyes away from the giant black wolf. He moved with a devastating fluidity, a shadow of death dancing under the pale moonlight. When the last of the Waverley assassins, a foolish beta who tried to ambush Roderick from behind, was crushed beneath the king's massive jaws, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the Whispering Woods. The snow was painted a gruesome crimson. Roderick stood in the center of the clearing, his massive chest heaving, his black fur matted with the blood of his enemies. He threw his head back and let out a howl that vibrated the marrow in Gwendolen's bones. It was a declaration of absolute victory, a sound that demanded submission from the very forest itself. Slowly, the giant wolf turned his glowing golden eyes toward the carriage. He padded toward her, the snow crunching beneath his heavy paws. When he was just a few feet away, the beast's form began to ripple and crack. In a visceral display of shifting, the black fur receded, bones realigned, and within seconds Roderick stood before her in his human form. He was completely bare to the freezing night air, his heavily muscled torso covered in old silvered battle scars and the fresh, steaming blood of the ambushers. He didn't even shiver. One of his guards silently stepped forward and draped a heavy fur mantle over his shoulders. Roderick accepted it without breaking eye contact with Gwendolen. He stepped into the ruined carriage, extending a hand to her. "Are you injured?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual, still laced with the gravel of his beast. Gwendolen shook her head, her trembling hand reaching out to meet his. The moment their skin touched, a jolt of pure, crackling heat shot up her arm. It wasn't just warmth, it was a profound, grounding tether. The panic that had been suffocating her dissolved, replaced by a fierce, undeniable sense of safety. Her inner wolf, previously a silent ghost, let out a distinct, approving purr in the back of her mind. "They were Waverley men," she whispered, stepping over the debris as he guided her back into the upright half of the carriage. "My father, Lord Waverley, they will not stop. They cannot afford the humiliation or the debt." Let them try, Roderick sneered, settling onto the bench beside her rather than across from her, his large frame radiating a furnace-like heat. The South has grown fat and complacent. If they wish to bleed against the stones of the North, I will gladly oblige them. The journey resumed at a much faster pace, the vanguard leaving the broken bodies behind as a grisly warning for anyone foolish enough to follow. For 3 grueling days, the carriage climbed higher into the jagged spine of the continent. The lush, vibrant autumn of the South was swallowed completely by an eternal, unforgiving winter. Blizzards hammered against the ironwood, but inside, wrapped in Roderick's cloak and pressed against his side, Gwendolen felt a strange, budding peace. On the 4th evening, the howling winds parted to reveal their destination. Winterfang's citadel was not a castle. It was a fortress carved directly into the heart of a massive, black stone mountain. Towering iron spires pierced the low-hanging snow clouds, and massive braziers burned with roaring green flames along the battlements, casting long, eerie shadows across the frozen valley. It was brutal, imposing, and stripped of all the delicate southern fineries Gwendolen was accustomed to. As the carriage rolled through the colossal iron gates into the inner courtyard, a small delegation was waiting to receive them despite the biting cold. Roderick helped Gwendolen down, keeping a possessive hand on the small of her back. She felt the heavy, scrutinizing stares of the northern court immediately. They were a hardened people, clad in leathers, thick furs, and dark steel. "Welcome home, Your Grace." A sharply dressed man stepped forward, offering a crisp, military salute. He had a stern, weathered face and a rigid posture. "Commander Harrison." Roderick nodded, acknowledging his second-in-command. "Ensure the perimeter patrols are doubled." Waverly sent an assassination squad into the Whispering Woods. "They failed, but I want no surprises." Harrison's eyes narrowed, flickering momentarily to Gwendolen before snapping back to his alpha. "Understood, my king." Beside Harrison stood a tall, matronly woman with silver hair pulled into a severe braid. "And the girl?" she asked, her voice carrying a no-nonsense practical edge. "You left to collect a tax and returned with a southern bride, Roderick. The healers are on standby, but she looks half-frozen." "Lady Catherine." Roderick's tone softened a fraction. "Gwendolen is not a prize. She is my fated mate and the Luna of the Blood Moon Court. You will treat her with the utmost reverence." A ripple of shock went through the gathered crowd. Fated mates were exceedingly rare, practically myths in the modern age. Catherine's eyes widened, and she immediately dropped into a deep, respectful curtsy. "My apologies, Luna Gwendolen. We are honored." But not everyone was pleased. From the back of the greeting party, a woman stepped forward. She was strikingly beautiful, with pale skin, ice-blue eyes, and hair as white as the snow around them. She wore a gown of deep blue velvet lined with Arctic fox fur, radiating an aura of cold, calculating arrogance. "A southern loon," the woman drawled, the voice like cracking ice. "Forgive me, Alpha, but rumors travel faster than carriages. Is this not the same Croft girl who was rejected at the altar 3 days ago? The one with the defective wolf?" Roderick's jaw locked, a lethal rumble starting in his chest, but Gwendolen instinctively placed a hand on his arm, silently asking him to stop. She recognized the look in the woman's eyes. It was the exact same look Beatrice had given her right before she destroyed her life. "Lady Isabella of the Frost Ridge clan, I presume?" Gwendolen spoke up, her voice surprisingly steady despite the freezing wind biting at her cheeks. She had memorized the political houses of the North during her tedious tutoring sessions. Isabella looked mildly surprised, but maintained her haughty sneer. "Indeed. I may have been rejected by a fool in the South," Gwendolen said, lifting her chin to meet the taller woman's icy glare. "But I was claimed by a king in the North. Do not confuse a refusal to participate in Southern parlor games with weakness, Lady Isabella." A heavy silence fell over the courtyard. Commander Harrison coughed to hide a smirk, and even Lady Catherine looked mildly impressed. Isabella's eyes flashed with indignation, her inner wolf bristling at the reprimand from a supposedly weak outsider. Roderick looked down at Gwendolen, a profound, savage pride burning in his amber eyes. He pulled her closer, his voice echoing loudly off the stone walls. "Prepare the great hall. Tonight we feast to welcome your new queen." and tomorrow the court will officially swear their fealty. The great hall of Winterfang's citadel was a cavernous space, lit by hundreds of thick tallow candles and roaring fireplaces large enough to roast a whole elk. Long, heavy oak tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, winter root vegetables, and flagons of dark spiced ale. It was a far cry from the delicate crystal goblets and sugared pastries of the Croft estate, but Gwendolen found the rawness of it intoxicating. She sat at the high table to Roderick's right, draped in a gown of midnight blue silk, provided by Lady Catherine, a heavy silver chain denoting her new status resting against her collarbones. Roderick was a silent, brooding presence beside her, but beneath the table his large hand rested warmly on her thigh, a constant reassuring anchor. Despite the celebratory atmosphere, the tension in the room was palpable. The northern lords and ladies were watching her every move. They were apex predators, evaluating the new addition to their pack. In their eyes, Gwendolen was a liability, a fragile southern flower, about to be crushed by the brutal winters and even more brutal politics of the Blood Moon Court. Lady Isabella sat with her clan near the front, her eyes practically boring a hole into Gwendolen. Isabella had long fancied herself the logical choice for Roderick's queen. She was a purebred northern wolf, ruthless and strong. Gwendolen's sudden arrival was a severe blow to her ambitions. As the feast progressed and the ale flowed, the volume in the hall rose to a raucous din, but it plummeted into absolute dead silence when Isabella suddenly stood up, a heavy silver goblet in her hand. "A toast," Isabella called out, her voice easily cutting through the remaining chatter. She stepped out from behind a table, walking to the open space before the high dais. "To our Alpha King, for his swift and decisive victory in the Whispering Woods." A chorus of "Hear, hear," and the slamming of mugs on tables echoed through the hall. Isabella's smile was sharp as a dagger, and, to his new bride, she looked directly at Gwendolen. "Though we northern wolves are simple creatures, we value one thing above all else: strength. The winter culls the weak, Luna. It is our way." Isabella took a step closer, deliberately leaking her aura into the room. It was an aggressive, dominating pressure, meant to force lesser wolves to avert their eyes and bare their throats. It was a direct, unmistakable challenge to Gwendolen's authority. "In the south, a Luna might hide behind her alpha's shadow," Isabella continued, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "But here, a Luna must lead the hunt. She must command the pack when the king is at war. Tell me, Lady Gwendolen, if the rumors of your dormant wolf are true, how do you intend to protect us?" Roderick's hand tightened painfully on Gwendolen's thigh. He leaned forward, his golden eyes flashing with a lethal, unrestrained fury. "Isabella, you tread dangerously close to treason." "No, Roderick," Gwendolen said quietly, her hand dropping to cover his. She stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. The heavy silence in the great hall stretched until it felt like a physical weight. Gwendolen stepped out from behind the high table, descending the 2 stone steps until she stood on the same level as Isabella, barely 5 feet away. Isabella's aura was pressing against her like a physical wall, trying to force her to submit. A few days ago in St. Bartholomew's Cathedral, Gwendolen would have crumpled. She would have believed she was broken, defective, and unworthy. But as she stared into Isabella's icy eyes, Gwendolen felt the phantom heat of Roderick's touch lingering on her skin. She felt the mate bond, a thrumming line of energy connecting her to the most powerful alpha on the continent. More importantly, she felt the wild, ancient thing inside her own chest, the wolf, that had been suffocated by corset strings, arranged marriages, and southern etiquette finally clawing its way to the surface. "You speak of strength, Lady Isabella," Gwendolen said, her voice carrying an unnatural, resonant echo that made several lords in the front row sit up straight. "You think because I do not bare my fangs at every perceived slight that I am weak. You think because my wolf slumbered she was dead." Gwendolen closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, tapping into the deep, terrifying well of power she had felt awakening in the carriage. When she opened them, a collective gasp ripped through the great hall. Her eyes, normally a soft hazel, were glowing with a blinding, ethereal silver light, the mark of a celestial bloodline, a lineage thought to be entirely extinct for over 3 centuries. The air in the great hall violently dropped in temperature. The roaring fires in the hearths flickered and shrank, overwhelmed by the sudden, suffocating pressure flooding the room. It wasn't the aggressive, violent aura of an alpha. It was the ancient, crushing weight of a true, dominant Luna. Isabella's smug expression vanished instantly, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. The oppressive aura she had been projecting was shattered completely. Isabella physically staggered backward, her knees buckling under the sheer supernatural weight of Gwendolyn's presence. Her inner wolf was screaming at her to submit, to grovel, to beg for forgiveness from the ancient predator standing before her. Gwendolyn took a single step forward. The sound of her velvet slipper on the stone floor echoed like a thunderclap. "My wolf was not broken, Isabella," Gwendolyn whispered, though the silver resonance carried her words to every corner of the frozen fortress. She was simply waiting for a kingdom worthy of her awakening. Isabella hit the stone floor, landing on her hands and knees, her head bowed deeply in absolute involuntary submission. Around the hall, hardened warriors, veteran captains and arrogant lords slowly slid from their benches, dropping to one knee, baring their necks in reverence to the overwhelming power of their new queen. Gwendolyn let the silence hold for a long, agonizing moment before reining in her aura. The silver glow faded from her eyes, returning to a warm hazel. The fires in the hearths immediately roared back to life, and the suffocating pressure lifted. She turned her back on the trembling Isabella and walked back up the steps to the high table. Roderick was standing now. He wasn't looking at the kneeling court. His glowing amber eyes were fixed solely on Gwendolyn, burning with a mixture of awe, fierce pride, and a dark, possessive hunger. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out, took her hand, and brought it to his lips, kissing her knuckles for the entire awestruck court to witness. The southern girl, who had been thrown away as defective, had just brought the most ruthless pack in the kingdom to its knees. And she was only just beginning. Winterfang's citadel transformed in the weeks following Gwendolyn's display of dominance. The oppressive, testing glares of the northern lords were replaced by profound reverence. The Blood Moon court, built on the absolute rule of strength, had recognized their true Luna. Yet, as the brutal northern winter settled over the jagged peaks, a different kind of storm was brewing in the south. Gwendolyn found herself standing on the high balconies of the citadel, wrapped in a thick cloak of white bear fur. Staring out of the frozen valleys, the mate bond between her and Roderick had blossomed from a spark of raw power into a deep, consuming fire. He was ruthless to his enemies, but fiercely protective of her, spending his nights showing her a tenderness that completely defied his monstrous reputation. She was no longer a pawn, she was a partner in his rule. But peace was a fragile illusion. Heavy footsteps crunched against the frost-covered stone behind her. Roderick wrapped his massive arms around her waist, pulling her back against his broad chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. "You are restless, little wolf," he murmured, his deep voice vibrating against her spine. "I feel it in the air," Gwendolyn confessed, leaning into his warmth. "Apollo and Lord Waverley, they will not accept this. They lost 50,000 gold pieces, their pride and their military leverage. They are plotting." Roderick turned her around, his amber eyes serious. "Commander Harrison just intercepted a raven from the borderlands. Your instincts are sharp. Lord Richard Waverley has formed a coalition. He has hired the Crimson Hand mercenaries, led by a ruthless warlord named Garrett Winslow. They are marching north." Gwendolyn's blood ran cold. "Winslow? He is a butcher. They say he burned the entire village of Oakhaven to the ground just for hiding a single rogue." "Waverley is desperate," Roderick sneered. "He is spinning a narrative for the southern courts, claiming I used dark blood magic to brainwash you and steal the Croft territory. He wants to rescue you to legitimize his siege." "My father?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Lord Henry Croft rides with them," Roderick said softly, his jaw tightening. "I am sorry, Gwendolyn. He chose his pride over his daughter." The betrayal stung, but the wound was old and scarred over. Gwendolyn nodded slowly. "Then we crush them." But while the Alpha King prepared his vanguard for a frontal assault at the mountain pass, A far more insidious threat slithered within the citadel's own walls. Deep in the subterranean crypts of Winterfang, where the ancient kings of the north were entombed, Lady Isabella stood holding a flickering torch. Her beautiful face was twisted into a mask of bitter, ugly jealousy. Gwendolen's humiliation of her in the Great Hall had destroyed her political standing. The northern lords who once courted her now treated her like a pariah. But steps echoed from the shadows and a cloaked figure emerged. It was Lord Reginald Harrington, a supposedly neutral merchant from the south who had been granted asylum in the citadel before the snows hit. In reality, he was Waverley's chief spymaster. "Is it done?" Reginald whispered, his breath pluming in the freezing dampness of the crypt. "The winch mechanisms for the outer iron gates have been soaked in acid," Isabella hissed, handing him a heavy iron key. "When Waverley's army arrives at the valley floor, Roderick will try to lock the fortress down to force a bottleneck. The gates will fail. They will be wide open." Reginald smiled, a greasy, satisfied smirk. "Lord Waverley sends his regards, Lady Isabella. Once the Beast King is dead and the Croft girl is dragged back in chains, you will be named the new Alpha of the Northern Territories. The South will recognize your sovereignty. Just make sure Roderick dies," Isabella demanded, her voice trembling with venom. "And leave the Luna to me. I want to personally rip that silver glow from her throat." 3 days later, the war horns echoed through the jagged peaks. The sound was a mournful, terrifying blast that shattered the morning silence. Gwendolen stood on the battlements beside Roderick, her heart pounding against her ribs. Spilling into the snowy valley below was an army of over 3,000 men and wolves. The banners of the Riverbend Pack and the Croft family fluttered violently in the biting wind, flanked by the blood-red flags of Garrett Winslow's mercenaries. At the front of the formation rode Apollo, clad and gleaming, in practical silver armor, with Beatrice sitting atop a white palfrey beside him, looking every bit the smug, victorious queen she believed herself to be. "They brought us slaughter to our doorstep," Commander Harrison growled, drawing his broadsword. "Lower the iron gates," Roderick commanded, his voice carrying over the roaring winds. "Archers to the ramparts, we funnel them into the gorge and break their front line." The guards rushed to the massive winches. The heavy chains groaned, slipping over the giant gears, but instead of the steady clanking of the gates lowering, a sickening screech of snapping metal tore through the air. The gears, eaten away by Isabella's acid, completely shattered under the tension. The heavy chains snapped, whipping violently across the courtyard. The massive iron gates, Winterfang's primary defense, remained locked in the open position. "Alpha!" Harrison shouted, panic bleeding into his voice. "The mechanisms are destroyed. The gates won't close." Roderick's eyes flared into a blinding gold. He looked down at the valley. Apollo's army had seen the failure. A massive cheer erupted from the southern ranks, and the heavy cavalry began to charge, aiming straight for the open throat of the citadel. A betrayal from within. Roderick grabbed Gwendolen by the shoulders, his grit bruising. "Get to the inner keep. Barricade the doors." "No," Gwendolen shouted over the din of battle. "I will not hide while my people bleed. Gwendolen, they outnumber us 3-1 without the gate." Roderick roared, his fangs extending as his beast pushed to the surface. "I cannot protect you and hold the line." "I don't need your protection," Gwendolen said, her hazel eyes bleeding into that terrifying luminous silver. "I am your Luna. We fight them together." The courtyard of Winterfang's citadel descended into absolute carnage. Roderick had shifted into his monstrous black wolf form, leading the vanguard in a desperate, brutal clash at the fortress entrance. He was a force of pure destruction, tearing through the Crimson Hand mercenaries like parchment. But the southern forces were relentless, pouring through the jammed gates in an endless tide of steel and fur. Gwendolen remained on the lower battlements, her heart aching as she watched her mate take a spear to the flank, shaking it off with a furious roar but slowing down. Commander Harrison was surrounded, fighting desperately against 3 Waverley Alphas. Then she saw them. Apollo and Beatrice had entered the courtyard, flanked by Garrett Winslow and a dozen elite guards. Apollo was laughing, watching the northern forces slowly being pushed back. He looked up, spotting Gwendolyn on the balcony. "Gwendolyn," Apollo sneered, his voice magically amplified to carry over the battle. "Look at what your defiance has caused. Your beast of a husband is dying. Surrender, and I might show you mercy. I might let you live as a servant in Beatrice's household." Beatrice laughed, a shrill, mocking sound that cut through Gwendolyn's soul. From the shadows of the stairwell behind Gwendolyn, Isabella emerged, holding a jagged, silver-tipped dagger. "There will be no surrender," Isabella hissed, lunging at Gwendolyn's back. "Only your death, you southern filth." Gwendolyn didn't even turn around. The ancient, dormant power that had awakened in the great hall surged through her veins, no longer a mere aura, but a physical, violently volatile force. She sidestepped Isabella's clumsy strike with unnatural speed. A hand shot out, grasping Isabella by the throat. The silver light exploded from Gwendolyn's eyes, illuminating the dark balcony. Isabella choked, dropping the dagger as the sheer, crushing pressure of Gwendolyn's lunar aura paralyzed her nervous system. "You sold your pack for jealousy," Gwendolyn whispered, her voice echoing with 1,000 ethereal voices. "You are stripped of your worth. You are nothing." Gwendolyn threw the treacherous woman aside. Isabella scrambled backwards, screaming in horror as she realized her connection to her inner beast had been completely, permanently severed by the celestial Luna's command. Gwendolyn turned her attention back to the courtyard. Roderick was pinned against the heavy stone walls by a dozen mercenaries, bleeding heavily from multiple wounds. Apollo was dismounting, drawing his sword to deliver the final, cowardly blow to the Alpha King. "Enough," Gwendolyn commanded. She didn't shout, but the word echoed like a thunderclap across the entire battlefield. The very air pressure in the valley dropped violently. The heavy snowfall abruptly stopped, suspended in midair. Gwendolyn vaulted over the stone railing of the battlements. As she plummeted toward the courtyard floor, her human form dissolved in a blinding flash of silver light. When she landed, the stone courtyard cracked beneath her weight. She was no longer a woman. She was a wolf of impossible proportions, standing shoulder to shoulder with Roderick's massive black beast. But where Roderick was darkness and shadow, Gwendolyn was pure, radiant light. Her fur was the color of liquid moonlight, shimmering with an ethereal, blinding brilliance. The battlefield froze. The southern wolves, including Apollo, stared in absolute, paralyzing terror. The legends of the celestial wolves, the divine protectors of the moon goddess, were real, and she was standing right in front of them. Gwendolyn threw her head back and unleashed a howl. It was not a sound of war, it was a sound of divine judgment. The shock wave of the howl ripped through the courtyard. Every single southern wolf, from the lowliest beater to the mercenary warlord Garrett Winslow, was violently forced to the ground. The sheer dominance in the sound commanded absolute, unbreakable submission. Their knees shattered the stone, their foreheads pressed into the bloody snow. They couldn't move, they couldn't breathe without her permission. Apollo was on his hands and knees, weeping in pure terror as the blinding silver wolf slowly padded toward him. Beside him, Beatrice had fainted from the sheer pressure of the aura. Gwendolyn looked down at the man who had humiliated her, who had betrayed her, who had tried to murder her mate. She didn't need to kill him. Her aura pressed down on him, stripping away his alpha status, crushing his inner wolf, until he was nothing more than a broken, ordinary man. Roderick, shifting back into his scarred, bleeding human form, limped to Gwendolyn's side. He rested his hand on her massive silver-furred neck. He didn't look at Apollo. He looked at the thousands of kneeling southern soldiers. "The debt is paid," Roderick's voice rumbled over the silent, terrified army. "Crawl back to the south. Tell them what you saw here today. Tell them the north belongs to the Alpha King and his celestial queen. Anyone who crosses our borders again will not live to regret it." When the southern army finally retreated, broken and leaderless, leaving Lord Henry Croft and Apollo to drag themselves back in disgrace, the true reign of the Blood Moon Court began. Gwendolyn, the discarded bride, had not only saved her new kingdom from ruin, but had ascended to a level of power the realm had not seen in centuries. She ruled alongside Roderick not as a prize, but as a legend, a testament that sometimes the greatest betrayals are merely the universe's way of guiding you to your true throne. If you found yourself holding your breath during Gwendolyn's stunning transformation and cheering for the Alpha King's ruthless devotion, you won't want to miss our next epic tale. The world of werewolf royalty is filled with dark secrets, treacherous courts, and fated mates who defy destiny. Did you love how Gwendolyn took back her power? Let us know your favorite moment in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button, share the story with your fellow romance drama lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, immersive audio stories every single week.